So other than the fact that they were starving to begin with, it was not an uncomfortable transition to step back away from the species because it's what they had known for hundreds of years.
Yeah, it was, it was kind of as if, I think, in the United States, if the Depression generation had gone back to the Depression in the 1950s or something, they would have been prepared for it because it was certainly within a collective memory.
Quick question.
Oh, yeah.
I once heard that there was a quote by Lenin where he said that communism and socialism is just a rung on the ladder to capitalism. Do you think that that could have actually been his goal, that that could be an accurate quote from him? Because I don't remember what I heard.
To go to capitalism?
Yeah. On the way to capitalism.
No.
That doesn't seem like...
No, I don't think, I think he must have been misquoted. I mean, during NEP, the new economic policy, he allowed some capitalism to exist again so that he could build up Soviet, what became at that point, Soviet factories in order to compete with capitalism. So it's kind of a couple steps back, but not necessarily to get into capitalism itself.
But he's not progressive for it.
No, not going to.
Lenin's two major economic policies, because he dies in 1924, right? First was war communism, and this was specifically instilled to deal with the Civil War and the encroachment of imperialist armies. It involved things like seizure of all railroads, all state factories, everything like this, under literally dictatorship. And again, keeping the framework of what the word dictatorship, where it comes from, it's actually a Republican thing going back to Rome. When Cincinnatus, who we have a city named Cincinnati named after, was a dictator. Rome basically came in and said, hey, guess what? We need you to defend Rome. And this is something he did at great expense to himself, because literally all he wanted to do was plow his fields and live out his life. But he actually does this at great personal loss, goes and defends Rome, and doesn't take anything from the Republic at all. He doesn't take any of the treasure, he just simply defends Rome, abdicates his dictatorship, provincial powers, and goes back and plows his fields. And I would actually ask the question, are you familiar with Lenin's last testament to the Central Committee, Catherine? Okay, obviously.
It would be
It's not meant to
insult.
insult. It's not meant to insult you, but right. He calls for an expansion of the bureaucratic class of the CC, more seats or whatever. So, I mean, do you think this? I have a reading of this as in order to get rid of the state, in order to absolve the state, right? Because it's an antagonism between two classes at this point. Do you think he's trying to take the proletariat class and make it more, bring it more up to speed, as with the actual thinking classes you mentioned in the lecture?
He definitely was trying to get the working classes and the peasant classes up to speed with the intellectual classes. I think practically we can see this in his efforts to reform the entire alphabet and the literacy campaigns, the Agitprop campaigns and everything. So yeah, if that's then reflected in his actual writings, absolutely. He had already been doing that. To keep that going would be a no-brainer. He needed a well-prepared, well-trained proletariat in order to outcompete capitalists. Whether it's under war communism, which Trotsky would have been happy with, or under the NEP, which Bukharin was happy with. Bukharin was particularly interested in getting the peasants up to speed so that they would lose that parochial mindset that I talked about in the lecture, and thereby serve as an example for other countries later. Kevin, good.
Yeah, I guess for me it has to do with Marx' understanding that he thought with being an industrial nation that we rebel. Russia, from my understanding at this time, is not. How can I legitimize a Bolshevik revolution in the country he's capable of holding that revolution? It should have been the US or the UK. Maybe even Germany.
Preferably Germany. I mean, you've got a socialist democratic party, a communist party in Germany that's even larger than that of the Russians at this point, in a smaller population. So yeah, I think Marx fully intended it would happen in those places first. Russia was not seen as particularly ready for anything. Engels kind of changed his attitude towards the end of his life, but again, it was tied to the communal system that he believed the peasants would have to get rid of their parochialism before they could move forward into socialism. And of course, that failure to get rid of the parochialism kind of doomed the hopes that it would be purely Marxist revolution in the first place. Eric?
Did Lenin get around to purging enemies of the state before he died, or did he just leave that to Stalin because he died young?
Oh no, there were a variety of enemies of the state out of their bureaucracy, but oftentimes they were rehired within 6 months to a year because they were necessary for their expertise. So there were efforts to get rid of them, and some of them were quite effective. I mean, you have huge numbers of the aristocracy and the church emigrate to places like the United States and France and even to Germany and farther west to the United States. But there still remained large numbers of the old classes within Russia, and they were dealt with sometimes violently if part of the White Army and captured, and sometimes not so violently. Sometimes they were simply given a paycheck if they were useful. Oh, we've blown.
There's a question on my trying to capture it.
Sorry.
Well, I would point out, given the historical, at this point, of Russian revolutions in general, right? The French Revolution or the Paris Commune, they've always come under attack. And so we see excessive measures always taken to defend them. Less so in the Paris Commune, more extreme in the French Revolution itself. But even nowadays, even if you think more contemporary revolutions in Latin America have always come under scrutiny, as well as more or less coups, given how the age.
Oh, absolutely.
So I guess I would say, where's my question going with this? Do you see them as being, really, was it more or less like pure chaos the entire time, or was it more of a control that Lenin was trying to maintain as in trying to guide it? Because obviously there's various conflicting forces going on. Do you see it as them trying to like, being really panicky about the whole situation of like, oh, now we're being invaded, oh, now we have this, now this, or do you think they were sort of probably...
I think they kind of assumed, because they had just come out of that war, that there would be backlash. I think the first sign of that was when the West basically began to cry out at the dissolution of debt agreements between Russia and France and Russia and the UK and such. So that Lenin knew from that point on that he was going to face a hostile West. That revolution likely was not going to be immediate in these countries. And I think they prepared for it a bit. I think giving Trotsky control of the Red Army, for example, demonstrates that, because he was ruthless. And so, like in anything, whether it's our own daily lives or what Obama's doing or what, Sarkozy's doing or even Lula is doing down in Brazil, ruling is partially preparing for what you think is going to happen and responding to what actually is happening. And Lenin was caught doing that, along with the rest of Sovnarkom. We don't want to give anybody the impression that Lenin is ruling on high. Sovnarkom and he, the leaders in Sovnarkom and he, get into it quite a bit at many times. To say that he is the only one guiding this revolution at this point would be fallacious. Barry?
What year did Lenin and Trotsky split?
Well, they had their differences. They remind me of best friends that just needle each other on basic things, occasionally. And they're not best friends. That would be wrong to claim. But Lenin really respected Trotsky and what he thought about revolution, but he also really trusted somebody like Bukharin, who was the total opposite of Trotsky. And he believed that this kind of debate, provided it didn't fall into factionalism, this kind of debate was actually healthy for the revolution, because they needed to sort out what were the best potential outcomes for the revolution. They realized that they had been thinking a lot, and they had to get into the practicalities. And with both men debating this around him, those practicalities could be discussed much better than otherwise. The big split, I would argue, came when Lenin chose the NEP over war communism. He basically put Bukharin, calling him even the ideological head of the revolution, ahead of Trotsky. And Trotsky, who, now this may be a surprise to many people, Trotsky, who as a political leader enjoyed limelight, didn't really appreciate being replaced by Bukharin. It hurt his ego, and it hurt Lenin's ego to be told by Trotsky that he was wrong. So you have a falling out over that, although it did not destroy their relationship at all, as Lenin's testimony would demonstrate.